Sign the papers or bury your daughter. 3 riders seized Rowena Ashby off the wagon seat, and neither one knew a gunslinger already trailed their dust. They dragged her down into the road gravel with her skirts tearing and her wrist bones grinding under a stranger's glove, and they laughed while they did it, because laughing was easier than looking at what they were, and because not one of the 3 had glanced up at the limestone rim rock a half-mile back, where a lone rider sat a gray gelding, so still he might have been carved there, watching them through a spyglass with a patience that should have frightened them more than any gun. They wanted no gold that morning. They wanted a signature, a line of ink on a railroad deed that her father had refused for 11 straight months, and they had decided, in the cold arithmetic of men who work for a company instead of a conscience, what they could not have known, could not have guessed from the dust and the dull thud of hooves, was that the quiet man trailing them had once worn the same railroad's badge himself, had once done the very work they were doing now, and had buried that man so deep in himself, to feel him climb back up out of the grave. This is the valley the maps called Coyote Wash, in the Arizona Territory, in the autumn of 1881, the season the aspens turned to copper on the high slopes, and 3 graves that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with a piece of paper. Stay with this one to the end, partner, because the man who trailed those riders that morning is the reason this story gets told around fires from the Mogollon Rim to the Sonora line, and the girl he rode after would need to become something harder than anyone, including her father. Before we ride further, if these tales keep you company, consider becoming a channel member. Tap the join button beside the channel name. It costs little and helps keep these stories coming. And while you settle in, tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I like to picture the fires this story travels to. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a morning 3 weeks earlier, before the note ever got nailed to a gatepost, before the wells went bitter, before anyone in Coyote Wash had cause to fear the sound of hoofbeats on the wagon road. Thomas Ashby had buried his wife on a rise above the north pasture 6 years before, under a cottonwood that had been a sapling when he staked the claim, and in all the seasons since he had never once considered selling so much as an acre of that ground. It was not stubbornness alone, though the men of the Territorial Land Office liked to write it up that way in their letters. Obstinate rancher, unreasonable holdout, the sole remaining obstacle on the survey line. It was that the pass running through his valley was the only gentle grade for 40 miles in either direction, the only place a railroad could thread the mountains without blasting half of them into gravel. And Thomas Ashby had looked at the little wooden cross on the rise, and decided that no amount of money printed by any bank back east was going to buy the ground his wife slept under so that freight cars could roll past her grave twice a day. His daughter Rowena had grown up on that decision the way other children grow up on scripture. She was 22 that autumn, dark-haired, sun-browned along the forearms from years of range work, with a steadiness in her that had nothing soft about it, nothing hard about it either, the kind of calm you find in people who buried a mother young and had to grow into her chores before they'd finished growing into themselves. She kept her father's ledgers because he trusted numbers to her more than to himself. She broke the colts. He was too proud to admit had gotten too fast for his knees. She had in a drawer beside her bed a folded plan for a one-room schoolhouse she meant to build on the flat below the orchard once the valley had enough children again to fill it, because right now half the families along the wash had already sold out. Worn down by 2 seasons of a railroad company that wanted their land and was in no hurry about getting it politely. That was the shape of the pressure by the time our story opens. Fence posts along the eastern line had turned up, burned in the night. Quiet and deliberate. No larger fire allowed to spread and draw a posse, just enough damage to cost a rancher a week of mending and a month of wondering who to blame. The well, at the old Hutchins place, 2 families gone already, had turned up bitter with something that killed a dog and sickened a boy. And, though nobody could prove a man's hand in it, everybody along that valley had started boiling their water and looking sideways at strangers. Notes had been left, twice, on the Ashby gate post, polite on their face, the kind of language lawyers write, offering a generous sum for the deed to the north pasture and the pass beyond it, offering it again a little louder the second time, that a man who valued his daughter's safety ought to consider the offer more carefully than he had the first. Thomas Ashby had burned both notes in the stove without discussing them with Rowena, which was in its own way the mistake that started everything, because a threat unspoken is a threat unprepared for. The man behind the notes never rode out to the ranch himself. Emery Colgrave did not dirty his boots with ranch yard mud if he could help it. He was the regional land agent for the Sable Pass line of the Territorial and Rio Verde Railroad. A narrow, precise man in his 40s who wore a silk vest, even in July, and carried a ledger everywhere he went, the way another man might carry a Bible. Coyote Wash was not a valley with a cottonwood, and a grave and a girl who wanted to build a schoolhouse. It was line 17 of a survey table, a projected saving of 41 days of grading and $18,000, if the company could route through the Ashby Pass instead of blasting a longer grade around the eastern ridge. Colgrave had made his career solving line 17 problems, and he had never yet met one that patience, money, or a well-chosen kind of pressure couldn't solve within a season. Coyote Wash had cost him 3 seasons already, and the Home Office had begun asking questions in a tone he did not care for. So, Colgrave had hired men the way he hired surveyors and grading crews as a line item, a cost of doing business, 3 names on a payroll ledger he kept as carefully as any other. Silas Merrow led them, a broad, sun-cracked foreman in his 40s, who had ridden for railroad outfits up and down the territory for 15 years, first as an honest grading boss, and later, as the work got uglier, as the kind of man a company called. Merrow believed in the flat and unexamined way some men believe things, that the railroad was progress and progress was inevitable, and that any rancher too sentimental to see it coming was going to get run over one way or another, so a man might as well be the one collecting a paycheck for the running. Beside him rode Dobbs, younger, quick with a skinning knife, and quicker still, with a grin that never once reached his eyes, a man who had found out early in life that fear was a tool other men were slow to pick up, and he had picked it up gladly. And behind them both rode Cutter Lomax, the coldest of the 3, a former bounty tracker out of the Texas Hill Country, who had long since stopped keeping track of which side of any law he rode on, so long as the money cleared. 3 men, 3 separate Rottenham, one who told himself a lie about progress, one who lacked the fear on other people's faces, and one who had simply stopped caring which was which. And together they made the kind of crew a company could point at a valley and walk away from, hands clean. It was into this valley, some 3 weeks before the Wagon Road, that a tired stranger rode down out of the Mogollon foothills on a gray gelding and took a week's work at the livery in the little town of Paloma Flats, 4 miles south of the Ashby spread. He gave his name as Gideon Slate, and no other information a soul could pry out of him. He was somewhere past his mid-30s, lean in the particular way of men who have gone hungry more than once, and never quite trusted a full plate since. With pale eyes that moved over a room and settled on the exits before they settled on anything else, he worked hard, said little, drank nothing stronger than coffee, and paid for his room on time. And if the townsfolk of Paloma Flats had any complaint about him at all, it was only that he seemed to be listening for something, always, even in the middle of an ordinary conversation about hay prices, as though some part of him was permanently cocked and waiting. Nobody in Paloma Flats knew that Gideon Slate had once carried a very different kind of badge. Nobody knew that 6 years before, in a railroad settlement 200 miles east, called Two Forks, he had worked for a company very much like the Territorial in Rio Verde, doing work very much like Emery Colgrave's men were doing now. The persuading, the pressuring, the quiet arithmetic of moving stubborn people off of valuable ground without quite crossing into a killing a jury would notice. He had told himself, for 2 years of that work, that he was simply keeping the peace between two forces that were going to collide with or without him, and that his presence made the collision gentler than it would otherwise be. He had believed that lie the way Silas Merrill believed his, right up until the night in Two Forks, when a fire meant only to frighten a holdout family had gotten away from the man who lit it, and a 9-year-old boy named Caleb Whitaker had not made it out of the smoke. The man who lit that fire on Gideon Slate's own crew, under Gideon Slate's own watch, had been Silas Merrill. Slate had quit the railroad the morning after Two Forks burned, had walked into the division office and set his badge and his contract on the superintendent's desk without a word of explanation, and had spent the 6 years since drifting from territory to territory doing day work, livery, fence mending, cattle drives. Whatever kept his hands busy and his mind too tired at night to dream. He had never fired the pistol he still carried in 6 years except at rattlesnakes and tin cans. He told himself most days that the man who had done the work in Two Forks was dead, buried as surely as young Caleb Whitaker, and that Gideon Slate the drifter was someone entirely different, someone harmless, someone who mended fences instead of breaking families. He had almost believed it, right up until the morning he was riding out along the Coyote Wash road with a load of harness leather for the Ashby Ranch, an ordinary errand the livery owners favored to a good customer, 15 years older and a good deal harder, but unmistakably, unforgivably, Silas Merrill. Something in Gideon Slate went very still and very cold in that instant, the way a lake goes still and cold just before a storm crosses it, and he reined his gelding off the road into a stand of juniper without a single conscious thought about why. Only the old animal instinct of a man whose life had once depended on not being seen before he chose to be seen. He watched from that cover as the 3 riders reached the wagon coming the other way down the road, Rowena Ashby's wagon, loaded with feed sacks from the Paloma Flats Mercantile, her father having sent her into town alone that morning, because the branding crew needed him at the corrals and, in 6 years of quiet threats that never quite became action, allowed himself to believe his daughter was safe on a public road in broad daylight. She was not. Merrill's horse cut in front of her team before she had time to do more than pull back hard on the reins, and Dobbs came up alongside faster than her mare could shy away from, catching the bridle in one gloved hand, while Lomax came around the far side and put himself between the wagon and the ditch, so there was nowhere for her to jump. Rowena Ashby did not scream first. She reached, quick as thought, for the shotgun her father kept wedged under the seat board, and she very nearly had it clear of the leather strap holding it before Dobbs's knife hand closed over her wrist, and it was only then, with the shotgun gone and Dobbs laughing, that thin laugh of his, and Merrow's hand fisting in the collar of her dress to haul her bodily off the seat, that she screamed, not from fear alone, but from a fury so total it came out of her like a physical blow, and she fought them the whole way down into the road gravel. Fought them with nails and teeth and a knee that caught Lomax hard enough in the ribs to earn her a backhand that split her lip. They had her bound and slung belly down across the front of Merrow's saddle inside 2 minutes, a rag knotted over her mouth to muffle what was left of her fury, and they left the wagon exactly where it stood, team-stamping and confused in their traces, and a folded note pinned to the seatboard with a skinning knife driven through it, Emery Colgrave's careful, lawyerly hand, informing Thomas Ashby that his daughter would be returned unharmed the moment he signed the deed to the north pasture. From the juniper stand, a half-mile back and rising, Gideon Slate watched all of it happen with his hand locked white-knuckled on his saddle horn, and every old instinct in him screaming to charge. 3 men, 1 rifle in his saddle boot, open ground, no cover. A girl, already bound, and no guarantee a rushed man on a tired horse could reach her before one of the 3 put a bullet through her rather than lose their prize. He had learned that particular lesson, once already, in 2 forks, about what a rushed rescue costs when it goes wrong, and the memory of a 9-year-old boy's face kept his hand off his rifle stock even as every muscle in his body. So he did the harder thing. He let them ride, and he followed. Word of the abduction reached Thomas Ashby within the hour, carried by a passing freight driver who'd found the abandoned wagon and the knife-pinned note. And the rancher's world came apart in the space of reading 11 sentences of Emery Colgrave's careful script. He rode for Paloma Flats at a gallop that nearly killed his horse, gathered what men he could, an aging deputy, 2 ranch hands, a rancher neighbor who'd lost his own daughter to the same railroad's pressure the year before, though only to a forced sale, never to this, and set out along the wagon road with more fury than plan, which is exactly the kind of pursuit 3 armed kidnappers with a 2-hour head start have no trouble losing in open country. They did lose them, by nightfall, at a fork, where the road split toward 3 different grazing allotments, and the tracks, scattered across sun-baked ground too hard to read. Thomas Ashby sat his horse at that fork, as the light went out of the sky, and felt, for the first time since his wife died, entirely and completely powerless, and it was the worst feeling he had known in 6 years. If these men decided she was more trouble alive than dead, could not. He did not know. Riding home in the dark to send riders for the territorial marshal, 40 miles distant, Gideon Slate had ridden that country before 6 years earlier in the service of a different railroad, doing exactly this kind of work, and he knew the way a man knows the floor plan of his own childhood home, precisely where a crew like Merrow's would run to ground with a hostage, not toward any town, where witnesses complicated everything, but into the broken country east of the Wash, where an old stagecoach relay station sat abandoned in a box canyon, the maps called Vireo Springs, walls of native stone 3 feet thick, a single defensible approach along a dry creek bed, water enough to hold out for weeks. It was the kind of ground a railroad regulator learned to identify the way a rancher learns to read weather, and Gideon Slate had learned it from men very much like Silas Merrow, in a life he had spent 6 years trying to forget he'd ever lived. He trailed them at a careful distance through the whole long afternoon and into the dusk, reading the sign the way he'd been trained to, a scuffed stone here, a broken twig there, the particular gait of 3 horses carrying uneven weight, and never once let his gray gelding's dust rise high enough to be seen from ahead. By the time the last light went out of the sky over the eastern ridge, he had confirmed what his gut had already told him 3 hours before: Vireo Springs, the old relay station. Merrow's crew rode into that box canyon a little after full dark, torches lit at the ruined station's door, and Gideon Slate made camp without a fire a mile back along the rim, and sat through the whole cold night with his rifle across his knees, watching a single lit window and thinking, stunned in the cold and patient calculations of the man he had buried. Inside that relay station, Rowena Ashby had spent the ride bound and jolted half senseless across a saddle, and the hours since arrival tied by both wrists to an iron ring sunk into the stone wall of what had once been the station's stable, a low, dim room smelling of old hay and older dust. One narrow window, too small to climb through, even if her hands had been free. She was frightened, in the honest and unashamed way any person with sense would be frightened. But underneath the fear, something colder and more useful was already working in her, the same steadiness her father had trusted with his ledgers. Turning itself now toward the problem of Silas Merrow and Dobbs and Cutter Lomax, the way she might once have turned it toward a column of unbalanced figures. She listened, she watched. She noted, in the dark, that Dobbs enjoyed cruelty the way some men enjoy a good meal, lingering too long over small unkindnesses, and that this made him careless with details a more disciplined man would have covered. She noted that Lomax spoke to her not at all, addressed her only as the cargo when he spoke of her to the others, and that this cold detachment, while it chilled her, also meant he took no pleasure in guarding her, and therefore no particular care. And she noted that Merrow, alone of the three, would not quite meet her eyes when he brought her water, that some old unhealed thing moved behind his face whenever he looked at a bound and frightened young woman, and she filed that observation away without yet understanding its shape. The way she'd learned to file away any figure in a ledger that didn't balance, trusting that its meaning would surface. Eventually, on the second night, it did. Emery Colgrave himself rode out to Vireo Springs on the second evening, a rare concession for a man who preferred to keep 3 counties of distance between himself and his own dirty work, but the Home Office's patience had a clock on it now, with no room for Merrow's crew to soften them out of whatever conscience they had left. Rowena, through the thin stone wall separating the stable from the station's main room, heard enough of that conversation to understand 3 things clearly: that this had never been about gold at all, that her father's refusal to sign over the pass had cost the railroad company something Colgrave called, and that Colgrave intended, if Thomas Ashby had not signed within 1 week, to instruct Merrow's crew to make certain the rancher understood the seriousness of the offer. She lay awake a long while after Colgrave rode out that night, wrists raw against the rope, and found that underneath the fear a new and colder feeling had begun to take root, not despair. If no one else was coming for her fast enough, then she intended to survive long enough to be there when someone finally did. She did not yet know that someone was already half a mile up the canyon rim, counting guards. Gideon Slate spent that second day doing the patient, invisible work he had once been paid to do for the opposite purpose, mapping the relay station's single approach, timing the guard rotations, noting that Dobbs took the exterior watch alone after midnight, noting the position of every horse in the corral and which fence rail was weakest should a fast retreat ever be necessary. He made no move to strike. 6 years of carrying the memory of 2 forks had taught him brutally that a rescue attempted before it was ready killed more people than it saved, and he was not, whatever the old cold part of him wanted, going to let 9-year-old boy's death teach him nothing. But on the second night, a little past 2 in the morning, with Dobbs, 3 hours into a lazy watch and half asleep against the corral post, Gideon Slate came down off that rim on foot, silent as smoke, and left 2 things behind him before he withdrew again into the dark. Fired not at any man, but through the crown of Merrill's own hat, where it hung on a nail by the door, close enough to wake the whole station in a panic, and a single word scratched with a knife point into the stable's outer door, where only someone inside would find it come morning. A name, 1 word, S-L-S-A-A, left for Rowena Ashby to find, though she could not yet know what it meant, to understand that she was not, in fact, entirely alone in that canyon. The warning shot did precisely what it was meant to do. It threw the whole camp into a night of shouting and wasted powder fired blindly at shadows, cost Merrill's crew 4 hours of sleep and a considerable measure of their nerve, and told them, in a language every gun hand on that frontier understood, that someone out there in the dark knew exactly where they were and had chosen for reasons unclear not to kill them yet. By the time Emery Colgrave heard about it 2 days later, the shape of a new and unwelcome variable had entered his careful ledger, one he had no line item for. Mid-morning of the 3rd day, with the whole crew jumpy and short-tempered from 2 sleepless nights, Silas Merrill rode the 2 miles into Paloma Flats under cover of a supply errand, and it was there, standing at the mercantile counter buying tobacco and rope, that he came face to face, for the first time in 6 years, with the man whose warning shot had put a hole through his own hat. Neither man said a word in that first frozen moment. Merrill's hand had gone halfway to his holster before some older instinct stopped it. Some memory of exactly how fast Gideon Slate's draw had once been rated among railroad regulators up and down 2 territories, faster even than Merrill's own, and faster than a man wanted to test on a public street with a deputy sheriff visible through the window of the office across the road. "Slate," Merrill said low, the tobacco forgotten in his hand, "I heard you were dead." "You heard wrong twice," Gideon answered, and there was nothing in his voice that Merrill could read as either threat or mercy, which was of every response available to him, the one that frightened Silas Merrill most. "Once about what you left in 2 Forks, staying buried." Something crossed Merrill's face then that a less patient man might have mistaken for regret, and might, in fact, have been exactly that. The particular guilt of a man who has spent 6 years telling himself a fire was an accident, confronted suddenly by the one witness who had never once let him believe it. But whatever moved behind Silas Merrill's eyes did not slow his hand for long. He set the tobacco down, back toward the door with the careful steps of a man leaving a rattlesnake he had no intention of provoking, and rode back to Vireo Springs faster than his horse wanted to go. To tell Emery Colgrave that the ghost trailing his crew had a name after all, and Colgrave, when he heard it, did the arithmetic the way he did everything, coldly and without sentiment. Gideon Slate. He remembered the name from a superintendent's report out of the 2 Forks division, 6 years stale, a regulator who had walked off the job the morning after a fire killed a child and had not been heard from since. A man like that carried a particular kind of danger, Colgrave understood, not merely a fast gun, though the reports suggested that too, but a man with nothing left to protect and therefore nothing left to lose, which made him, in the specific mathematics of a company ledger. He doubled the watch at Vireo Springs that same afternoon, sent word for 2 more hired guns from the railroad's Tucson office, and moved up his deadline for Thomas Ashby's signature from 1 week to 3 days, because a man like Colgrave understood that time now. If you're finding some peace in this fire tonight, that's exactly why I do these, so you have somewhere quiet to sit a while. If you want more of these Gunslinger tales before anyone else sees them, become a channel member. Just tap join right beside the channel name up top. It costs you little, and it means a great deal to a small channel like this one. Now, back to Vireo Springs, and to the third night, the night everything in that canyon changed. Rowena Ashby had, by the third day of her captivity, learned every seam and weakness of that stable room the way she'd once learned every seam and weakness of her father's account books, and she had learned something else besides, watching the scratched word Slate on the door each time Dobbs came to check her ropes. Someone was working a slow and patient plan on her behalf, and that the smartest thing she could do in the meantime was make herself ready to be rescued rather than simply wait to be. She had worked the rope at her wrists raw and bloody but steadily looser against the iron ring, a fraction at a time, in the hours when the guards changed and no one watched her closely, and, by the third night, though she gave no outward sign of it, Gideon Slate came down off that canyon rim again, a little after midnight on the third night, and this time he did not come to leave a warning. The doubled guard Colgrave had ordered worked against Merrill's crew as much as for them. 4 men now instead of 3, sharing a rotation meant for 3. Tired and short-tempered and stretched thin across a perimeter they'd never had to hold before, and a tired, overstretched guard. Gideon took the outer watchman first, a hired Tucson gun. None of this story needs a name for. Silent and clean. The man waking 3 hours later with a lump on his skull and no memory of the blow. He crossed the corral in the dead space between rotations, cut 2 of the horses loose to scatter and confuse any pursuit, and reached the stable door with a full quarter hour still on the clock before the next watch change. He found Rowena Ashby already half free of her ropes, working the last twist loose with her teeth, and when the door swung open on him instead of Dobbs, she did not scream. She looked at the lean, hard-eyed stranger in the rust-colored duster, at the word carved on the outside of her prison door, and understood, in the space of a single held breath, exactly who he was. "You're the one who's been out there," she said low, her voice steady, despite the blood dried at her split lip. "Ma'am, we don't have time for introductions," Gideon answered, already working the last of her bonds free with a knife blade. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before that watch changes, and I mean to use every one of them getting you out of this canyon." She did not argue, and she did not slow him down. Within 4 minutes, they were mounted double on the gray gelding, threading the dry creek bed at a pace just short of reckless, and it was nearly 6 full minutes after that before a Tucson gun found the empty stable and started shouting the alarm that sent the whole camp scrambling for horses. They did not make it clean away. That would have been too easy a story, and it would not have been true to what Emery Colgrave's money had bought. Cutter Lomax, the coldest and most competent of the 3 original hires, had not slept the doubled watch like the others. Some old bounty tracker's instinct had kept him half alert even off duty, and he was mounted and moving within 90 seconds of the alarm, cutting cross-country on a shorter line than the creek bed Gideon had chosen. Betting correctly that a man burdened with a rescued hostage would favor caution over speed. He very nearly guessed right. He caught them at first light, 6 miles out, at a narrow wash where the gray gelding, carrying double weight over broken ground all night, had finally begun to falter. The fight that followed was short, ugly, and entirely without the clean choreography of a dime novel. Lomax opened with a rifle shot from cover that took a chip of stone off the wash wall a foot from Rowena's head, and Gideon put her down hard behind a boulder with a single word, down, and turned to answer with his own rifle. And for the better part of 10 minutes the two men traded fire across 60 yards of broken rock, while Rowena Ashby lay pressed flat against stone, with her heart hammering, and no weapon in her hands at all, which she found, in that long, ugly stretch of gunfire, to be the single worst. The simple fact of having nothing to do but wait and hope a stranger's aim held. It held. Gideon Slate had not fired a gun at another man in 6 years, had told himself in Paloma Flats that the part of him capable of it was buried for good. The training in a man's hands does not forget itself the way a man's conscience sometimes wishes it would. Certain his rifle had the range advantage, Gideon's shot took him through the shoulder before Lomax's own finished tightening on the trigger. A wound meant to end a fight, not a life, fired by a man who had promised himself 6 years ago, over a small grave in Two Forks, that he would never again be careless with how much force a moment actually required. Lomax went down, hard alive, disarmed, and cursing, and Gideon left him tied to a scrub oak, with water enough to survive until someone found him. Because whatever the man he'd once been might have done in that moment, the man he had chosen to become in the years since. They rode on, slower now, the gelding blown and Rowena's hands shaking with an adrenaline crash. She refused to let show in her face, and it was mid-morning before Gideon judged them far enough clear to risk a full stop at a spring-fed hollow in the foothills he remembered from an earlier life, sheltered by juniper and defensible on 3 sides. Good ground. The kind a regulator learns to spot, the way a rancher learns to read weather. It was there, over a small smokeless fire, and the last of his trail rations, that Rowena Ashby finally asked him the question that had been sitting behind her eyes since the stable door swung open. "Why," she said, watching him check the load in his rifle with hands that had gone perfectly steady again, "would a stranger risk his neck for a girl he's never met, against men who work for a railroad with more money than God?" Gideon was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, and when he finally did, his voice had none of the flatness she'd heard from him back at the stable door. Something rawer underneath it, something that had clearly cost a great deal to keep buried this long. "Because 6 years ago I worked for a railroad myself," he said. "Different line, same kind of ledger, same kind of men doing the same kind of work Merrow's crew is doing to your family now. I was one of those men. I told myself I was keeping a bad situation from getting worse, that my being there made the pressure gentler than it would have been without me. I believed that lie a long while." He set the rifle down across his knees, and for a moment the hard eyes went somewhere far away. Somewhere, Rowena understood, without being told, was a small railroad town, 200 years and 200 miles distant. There was a boy in a settlement called Two Forks, 9 years old. His family wouldn't sell, same as your father won't sell, and a fire got set one night that was only supposed to scare them into moving. It also killed that boy, because fires don't check a man's intentions before they burn. I wasn't the one who lit it. I was the one standing close enough to stop it, and didn't move fast enough. And the man who did light it, the man whose match it was, rides with the crew that took you. Silas Merrow. Rowena sat with that a long moment, the fire popping softly between them. And when she spoke again, her voice had none of the fear left in it that had colored the last 3 days, only a hard, clear anger that Gideon recognized. "Then you're not out here for me at all," she said. "You're out here for that boy. I'm out here for both of you." Gideon answered, "Doesn't have to be one or the other. A man can owe two debts at once." They rested only until the horse recovered enough to carry them again, because both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that Emery Colgrave's crew would not simply let a rescued hostage walk free to tell a territorial marshal what she'd overheard through a stable wall. Rowena Ashby knew, now, that the abduction had never been about ransom, that it was leverage in a scheme to force a signature on a fraudulent right-of-way, that Colgrave had personally threatened harm to her father, and was worth more to Colgrave's enemies, and more dangerous to Colgrave himself, than her captivity had ever been. They would come after her again. And this time, Gideon judged grimly, they would not send 3 men who could be picked off one at a time in the dark. They reached the Ashby ranch by early afternoon, and the reunion between Thomas Ashby and his daughter was the kind of thing this story does not need many words to tell. A rancher who had aged 5 years, in 3 days falling to his knees in his own yard with his arms around a daughter he had feared, in his worst hours, he would never hold again. Both of them weeping without shame in front of ranch hands who found urgent business elsewhere to look at. But the relief in that yard was short-lived, because Rowena, even through her own exhaustion, would not let her father simply celebrate. She told him everything. The leverage scheme, Colgrave's deadline now moved up to 3 days, the 2 additional guns coming from Tucson, and the hard truth that whatever the railroad company had planned before her rescue, because a company that had already committed a felony to force a signature had very little left to lose by committing a second one. Gideon Slate stood at the edge of that reunion, apart from it, the way a man stands apart from a warmth he does not believe himself entitled to share. And it was Thomas Ashby himself who crossed the yard first, extended a rough rancher's hand, and asked the stranger's name. "Gideon Slate," he answered simply, and did not offer the rest of it. Not yet, not until he'd earned the trust that came with a full accounting. "Whatever you are, whatever brought you to my valley," Thomas Ashby said, gripping that hand hard, "you've got a home on this ranch as long as you want one, and my thanks for as long as I draw a breath." "Don't thank me yet," Gideon said quietly. "Colgrave's crew isn't finished. If anything, I've made this worse for you, not better." He was right, and everyone standing in that yard understood it inside the hour, when a rider came in hard from the direction of Paloma Flats, with word that had traveled fast even by frontier standards. Had abandoned all pretense of subtlety. He had wired the Home Office for authorization to settle the Coyote Wash matter by whatever means proved necessary. Had received it within hours. A railroad company, it turned out, had very little appetite for scruple once a rival line began threatening to steal its right-of-way through delay, and had sent word to every hired gun he could reach, across 2 territories, that there was work and good pay waiting at Vireo Springs for men willing to finish what Merrill's original crew had started. Thomas Ashby's ranch, defensible in the ordinary sense against ordinary trouble, was not built to withstand what was coming. Gideon Slate knew that better than anyone in that yard, because he had once helped plan sieges very much like the one now being assembled against it from the other side of the ledger. "We can't wait for this fight to come to us on ground we didn't choose," he told Thomas and Rowena, and the small handful of ranch hands and neighbors who gathered by evening, all of them frightened and none of them willing to say so aloud. A railroad with money enough to hire strangers from 2 territories away isn't going to stop because we ask nicely. But there's one thing in our favor. They want this valley intact. The pass, the grade, the ground itself. They can't afford to burn it flat the way another kind of enemy might. That means they'll come at us the way Colgrave thinks, careful, contained, minimizing damage to the property he still means to own. We can use that. What followed over the next 2 days was the kind of hard, unglamorous labor that never makes it into the songs men sing about gunslingers. But that wins the fights those songs celebrate, Gideon walking every foot of the Ashby property. Marking the choke points a company of hired guns would be forced to use if they wanted to approach without exposing themselves on open ground. Rigging tripwires strung with cowbells along the 2 blind approaches through the orchard, cheap and simple and utterly reliable in the dark. Setting a false, obvious defensive line along the front gate that any competent attacker would identify and plan around, while the real strength of the defense waited concealed along a second line the attackers would not expect until they'd already committed past the point of easy retreat. And moving every head of stock, every hand not willing to fight, over her considerable protest, into the reinforced root cellar dug deep beneath the ranch house, stocked with water and enough rifles to hold a doorway against far worse odds than a single man alone. Rowena's protest was not idle stubbornness. She had watched Gideon Slate move through those 2 days of preparation with the calm, exact confidence of a man doing familiar work, and something in her had recognized, with a clarity that surprised her, that hiding in a cellar, while other people fought for her family's land, "You taught me the rope trick that got me halfway free before you ever opened that door," she told him on the second evening, standing in the barn while he checked the action on an old shotgun he meant to leave her. "I can learn a trigger, too." He looked at her a long moment, weighing something behind those pale eyes, and then, without argument, spent an hour of the fading light teaching Rowena Ashby to load, aim, and fire a rifle she had, until that week only, unglamorous fundamentals that keep a person alive in a fight. Brace, breathe, squeeze, and never, under any circumstance, fire at a shape you have not confirmed. "Your father's ledgers taught you patience with numbers," Gideon told her, adjusting her grip with a hand that had gone over these 2 days, noticeably gentler than the flat, guarded stranger who'd cut her free at Vireo Springs. "This isn't so different. Numbers that don't balance get you a wrong total. A shot fired in a hurry gets somebody killed who didn't need to be." She proved over that single hour to be exactly the kind of student her father's ledgers had promised: quick, exact, unwilling to accept sloppiness in herself, even under pressure. Rowena Ashby had gone from a girl who'd nearly lost her father's shotgun on a wagon road to a young woman who could put 5 rounds into a fence post at 40 yards, with her hands steady and her breathing even. And something had shifted, too, in the quiet space between her and the man teaching her, because both of them understood, with the particular clarity people find before a fight, that naming it now would only make whatever came next harder to survive. They struck at Coyote Wash on the 3rd night, exactly as Gideon had predicted. Colgrave's newly hired guns, 11 men in total, counting Merrill and Dobbs among them, moving in from 2 directions under cover of dark, confident in their numbers. The cowbells along the orchard line sounded first, a jangling, unglamorous alarm that would have made a poor sound in any song, but that told every defender behind the false gate line exactly where the first wave of attackers had committed. And Gideon's rigged tripwires did the rest of that opening work. No dynamite, no dramatic explosion. Just simple ropes strung ankle height that sent 3 separate hired guns sprawling in the dark, disoriented, weapons scattered, easy to disarm and bind before they'd fully understood the fight had already turned against them. The real battle, once the first wave stumbled and the second wave realized the gate line was a decoy, moved to the second defensive position Gideon had prepared, and here the fighting turned harder and uglier, the kind of close, chaotic exchange that no plan, however careful, can fully control once it begins. Thomas Ashby, fighting from a barricaded window with a steadiness that surprised even his own daughter, took a graze along the shoulder from a rifle round that sent him briefly to his knees before a neighbor pulled him back under cover. 2 of the ranch hands were wounded, one seriously enough that the fight's outcome would matter a great deal to whether he lived to see the following week, and Dobbs, the knife man who had enjoyed Rowena's fear back at Vireo Springs, pressed the assault on the root cellar itself with a recklessness born of overconfidence. Certain the cargo inside was unarmed and helpless, exactly as he'd left her days before. He found out otherwise. Rowena Ashby, braced in the cellar doorway, exactly as Gideon had drilled her, put a single round through Dobbs' gun arm before he'd finished forcing the door, a shot that cost him the fight and very nearly his hand, fired with hands that did not shake despite everything her body had been through that week, and it was in that moment, more than any other in this whole story, that the girl who had been dragged off a wagon road became something her father had not entirely seen coming. Not a victim who had survived an ordeal, but a woman who had learned in the space of a few desperate days exactly what she was capable of when someone she trusted showed her how. Silas Merrill, for his part, did not fight that night with the flat confidence of a man simply doing paid work. Something had been eating at him since the mercantile counter in Paloma Flats, since the moment Gideon Slate's voice had said 2 forks staying buried. And when the 2 men finally came face to face in the chaos of the yard, Gideon moving to cut off a flanking attempt on the barn, Merrow rounding the same corner from the opposite direction, neither man raised a weapon in the first frozen second, both of them caught, for just that one breath, in 6 years of shared guilt, neither had ever spoken aloud to another living soul. "I never meant for that boy to die," Merrow said, and his voice cracked on it in a way that told Gideon more than any confession could have that the words were true. "I've told myself that every night for 6 years, and it's never once made it feel less like a lie." "I know," Gideon answered, and his own voice was rougher than he meant it to be. "I've told myself the same thing about not stopping you fast enough. Neither one of us gets to be the man who didn't do it, Silas. We're both the men who let it happen." "Then we're both owed the same ending," Merrill said, and went for his gun. He was not fast enough. He had not been fast enough 15 years ago either. In the fair contests, the 2 of them had once run for sport at railroad camps up and down 2 territories, and 6 years of guilt had not sharpened him any. Gideon's shot took him in the chest before Merrow's own cleared leather, and Silas Merrow went down in the dirt of a valley he had helped terrorize, dying, not with the particular villain's snarl the songs would give him, but with the quiet, almost grateful look of a man who has spent 6 years waiting for a debt to finally come due. Gideon knelt beside him a moment in the middle of a fight still raging around them both, and Merrow's last words, barely more than breath, were not a curse and not a plea, but something closer to a confession. "Tell the boy's people I'm sorry," he managed. "Tell them it was never supposed to," and the sentence went unfinished because it did not need finishing for Gideon Slate to understand exactly what it would have said. By the time the last of Colgrave's hired guns broke and scattered into the dark, unwilling to keep fighting for a company that had never once told them the full and ugly truth of what they were being paid to defend, the sky over Coyote Wash had begun to gray toward dawn, and the yard of the Ashby ranch was littered with the wreckage of a battle that had cost real blood on both sides, but had, in the end, held. Cutter Lomax, still recovering from the shoulder wound Gideon had given him days before, was among those captured rather than fled, and it was his testimony, offered in exchange for leniency, once the territorial marshal finally arrived, 2 days later, that unraveled the rest of Emery Colgrave's scheme in full. The burned fence lines, the poisoned well scheme in full, the burned fence lines, the falsified survey figures Colgrave had submitted to justify the pressure campaign in the first place, and the direct order, in Colgrave's own hand, authorizing whatever means proved necessary against the Ashby family. Emery Colgrave himself was arrested 3 weeks later in the railroad's Tucson office, his silk vest and his careful ledger doing nothing to protect him once federal investigators, alerted by the territorial marshal's report, began pulling at the thread of a right-of-way scheme that turned out to reach into 2 other valleys along the same line. Each one pressured by the same quiet arithmetic of burned fences and poisoned wells, and in one earlier and less fortunate case the investigation uncovered an outcome considerably worse than an abduction that ended in rescue. The Territorial and Rio Verde Railroad, facing a scandal it could not afford to let reach the newspapers unmanaged, quietly abandoned its claim to the Coyote Wash Pass entirely and rerouted its grade around the longer eastern ridge at a cost, ironically, considerably higher than the $18,000 Colgrave had once calculated a signature would save. Thomas Ashby's north pasture and the little cottonwood rise where his wife slept stayed exactly where it had always been, untouched by any grade or any freight car, and within the year the flat below the orchard had its schoolhouse after all, built with lumber the valley's grateful families donated once word of what Rowena Ashby had survived, and what she had helped defend had traveled the length of Coyote Wash and back. As for Gideon Slate, he stayed through the whole slow business of the marshal's investigation and the healing of the wounded and the difficult work of burying Silas Merrow, whom nobody in the valley wanted in their cemetery but whom Gideon insisted on burying anyway at his own labor on a quiet rise a respectful distance from the Ashby graves, because a debt owed to a dead man, he told Thomas Ashby, does not stop being owed just because the man who owed it hated what he'd become. He stayed, too, long enough that something had grown between himself and Rowena Ashby in those weeks that neither of them tried very hard to pretend wasn't there, not the sweeping, breathless romance the songs liked to promise, but something steadier and, in its way, rarer, the particular closeness of 2 people who had each, in their own fashion, learned exactly what the other was capable of under the worst pressure either of them had ever faced, and had come to trust it completely. They did not marry that autumn, and this story will not pretend they did, because Gideon Slate carried 6 years of ghosts he had not yet finished laying to rest, and Rowena Ashby had a schoolhouse to build and a valley to help heal, and both of them understood, without needing the words dealt, that what stood between them was not a lack of feeling, but simply time, and the honest work of 2 people learning to trust a future neither had expected to survive long enough to want. He rode out of Coyote Wash on a cold morning in early winter, with a promise to return once the last of what he owed to Two Forks and to the memory of a 9-year-old boy had been properly settled, a promise Rowena chose to believe, and a promise this story is glad to tell you that he kept. Before we get to how this old man came to know all of that, one more thing, partner. Those of you who tap join and become a channel member make tales like this one possible, and my thanks rides with you. I was a young man myself the autumn this happened, working a grading crew for a rival line that never did get its rails through Coyote Wash. And I heard the whole of it secondhand from men who'd ridden with the posse. He told it the way I've told it to you, not as a tale of a lone gunslinger riding in to save a helpless girl, though that's the shape the songs later gave it, but as the truer and harder story of a young woman who learned, in the space of a single terrible week, and a man who had spent 6 years running from the worst thing he'd ever let happen, only to find that the only way through that kind of guilt was to finally stand and use everything that guilt had taught him in service of somebody else's family. There's a lesson in that, if you're looking for one, and I don't mind telling you what I think it is. A man's past doesn't have to be the whole of what he is. It can be the very thing that saves somebody else if he's willing at last to stop running from it and turn around and use it. And a woman handed nothing but fear and rope and an iron ring and a stable wall can, if she's got the steel for it, turn every one of those days into the exact tools she needs to walk back out into the world stronger. This has been a Wild West story, friends, a work of fiction inspired by the true grit of the frontier and the true cost the railroad sometimes exacted on the families in their path. No real persons depicted, though I'd wager every valley west of the Mississippi has its own quiet version of Coyote Wash. If it kept you company tonight, do an old storyteller a kindness and hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring the bell so the next one finds you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and whether you'd have stood your ground the way Rowena Ashby did, or run. Until our trails cross again, partner, keep your powder dry, and your soul a little more honest than the men in this story ever managed to be.